Hi.
We're here today with Dr. Donald King, a distinguished research professor here in the School of Information and Library Science at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Welcome, Don.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoy being here, and I enjoy having the opportunity to talk to you about some things.
Well, you have had an illustrious career and continue to be an active researcher in the field of information science, one of the pioneers in our field, one of the founding fathers, I might say. And we're sort of going to let you just turn it loose and reflect a bit, and tell us about this field and how exciting it is, and why you're still just as enthused today as you were 30 or 40 years ago.
40 at least.
Yeah.
Well, I kind of came into the field through the back door, and I wasn't a particularly good student in high school or college, and during the Korean War I decided that rather than staying in school, I'd stop, go out and be a Marine fighter pilot, and I was during the Korean War. Mm-hmm. And then I went back to school, got married, and got serious. And finally ended up taking statistics at the University of Wyoming. It was a great place to go to school. And after I got my master's degree, I ended up going to work for one of the top statistical consulting companies, General Analysis Corporation. And a couple of guys at the University of Wyoming suggested maybe we ought to go into business together. This was a year after I had graduated. Mm-hmm. And so that's what we did. And we started a company called Westat, Western Statistics. People often asked us what Westat stood for, and we said it was named after Charlie Westat. But it was Western Statistics, and we started in Denver, Colorado. My two co-founders were Dr. Ed Bryant, who was the head of the statistics department at Wyoming, and another graduate that graduated the same time I did. And it was a tough year. Mm-hmm. We had one $11 job, $1 a data point, to do a least squares analysis on 11 data points, and we had a golden bank job, which was probably $150 or something like that. And so Jim Daly ended up going to work in a ski shop, and Ed Bryant was teaching down at Tempe at the time. But we got through that first year and got a contract with the U.S. Patent Office, and the contract was to develop experimental design for some studies they were doing on automated search systems and doing coordinate indexing and that kind of thing. And when we got there, of course, the work was to more or less develop the design for those studies. But I found as I got into it that the real question was what to measure, and how do you measure the quality of indexing and the quality of the search systems and this kind of thing. And it was kind of an early age in which evaluation of information systems was beginning to develop. Cleverton in England was doing a lot of work. Wolf Lancaster was doing some things with Herner and Company and so on. And so that's in a sense how I got into it. Yeah. And I found that it kind of was very interesting work. I loved the data that we were working with. I loved the people we were working with. And as a consequence, we began to broaden out, and I did some work for the old Clearinghouse for Federal Scientific and Technical Information on developing a model for to tell whether they should print or store information and this kind of thing. And we did some pricing studies with them, some user studies and this kind of thing. And I kind of got caught up in it. And I was doing work in other areas as well, like on the U.S. metric system, and we did no-fault insurance studies and this kind of thing at Westat. Westat it began to be really one of the top statistical companies in the country. Right. And in the late 60s, early 70s, there was a lot of acquisitions and mergers and this kind of thing. And as a consequence, we kind of got gold fever.
Yeah.
And accepted a acquisition offer by, of all people, American Can Company. They used to say that they wanted to be in the communications business because of their two cans and a string between the two cans and all that kind of stuff. But I really wasn't against. I was against the acquisition. I like to be independent, but we went ahead and did it. And they acquired a number of different companies, one including Aspen Systems Corporation, that was one of the early organizations that did full text searching. And they had a good system, they had a good set of people, and we decided to acquire them. And I said it was because of what they had accomplished, not because of the value of the company, because they had lost a lot of money and they were on the verge of bankruptcy. And we also acquired a company called Home Testing Institute in Long Island, and they were a marketing research company, and they were near bankruptcy, and we acquired them, and I was asked to go up and run the company for a year or so, and did so. We actually we're doing a lot of things like television quality ratings, and we had 120 household panels. I called it the living database, and so we did a lot of product search research out of that. And I did take it from a level of about 600,000 a year up until about 2.5 million in the year I was there.
Wow.
But we never really quite got the profit that they were looking for, and so I ended up going back down to Westat, and I enjoyed it up there. And actually, they were acquired back by the previous owner, and he asked me to come back up and run the company again. But I really, that's really not what I wanted to do. And so anyway, after a while, I negotiated getting out of my contract, and ended up in a couple of years of starting King Research, and back in 1976. And we were doing a lot of work for the National Science Foundation at that time, particularly under the umbrella of called statistical indicators of scientific and technical information. And also I did some studies on editorial processing centers, because there was a issue then of the fact that there was only about 13% of the publishing companies had more than 3 publications, journals, and it was just not large enough to justify the capital requirements to get computerized photocomposition or other kinds of equipment that was necessary to do automatic input. So we did an editorial processing study, and some people actually applied the recommendations we make, the American Chemical Society and some others. But the notion was at that time that journals weren't very well received. They weren't being used. They thought it was a big waste of paper, and there were some studies that had been done in the early 60s by Garvey and Griffith. You may remember the name. Great studies, by the way. But one of the components of the study was to survey scientists of all kinds, and to try to find out how extensive the journals were actually being used. And what they did is to send out tables of contents, and they asked the recipients to indicate which articles they read.
Right.
And this was done about 2 or 3 months after publication. And they ended up reporting that the articles were only read an average of about anywhere from, say, 10 to 20 times, depending on the field of science. And so that kind of fueled the notion that journals really weren't worth keeping, and that we needed to go somewhere else to get the kinds of information that were necessary. And there were a lot of innovative projects that NSF was funding at that time to look into new ways of doing it. And we won a contract to look into the journal literature in more detail. And as I got into it, I read the Garvey-Griffith report, and I realized that they weren't reporting the amount of use of the articles for the entire population from which they sampled, but only the responses. And they didn't project that up to the sample. And I drove over from, I was in Maryland at the time, drove over to Johns Hopkins and talked to Bill Garvey about that. And he said that, well, I'm an experimental psychologist. I was comparing the, I didn't care how much it was being used. I was comparing the use among the different fields of science. Anyway, and we talked about it a while, and so I went ahead and took some of his data and projected it up and found that rather than being just a few uses per title or per article, that it was really up closer to 600 or 800. And so we ended up doing a very detailed analysis on the journal literature, and I kind of thought and had been thinking for a long time that we needed to look more at not just authors and not just publishers and not just libraries and not just the readers and that kind of thing, but try to tie it together and think in terms of what kind of an economic impact the whole system had and what the relationships were among those different participants. And that's exactly what we did, and ended up publishing a book on it in the early 80s. And we estimated that, as I recall, it was that the total cost of the system was around $15 billion. Wow. And that the largest portion of that cost was readership. That is the time that the scientists spent getting access to the information and reading. I mean, by far the biggest cost. And to me, that was an indicator of the value of the information that they were reading. They wouldn't spend that time if they didn't feel that it was absolutely important to them to do that. And so anyway, that we did a bunch of studies of that kind for the National Science Foundation. Then there was Woody Horton. I don't know whether you remember the name.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, he was doing a study on the Commission on Federal Paperwork during the late 70s. And he asked me to look at the value of the government-provided information, partially because of some studies I had done for the old National Technical Information Service, and the fact that I had put a value on journals based on how much people were willing to pay in their time and effort and that kind of thing. And so we did a study for him, and that's turned out to be pretty useful, I believe, and they published it as a chapter of their book and this kind of thing. And as a consequence, Joe Coyne at the OSTI down at in Oak Ridge was running the Department of Energy information system that was equivalent to NTIS, but for the Department of Energy, asked if we could do a value study for him. And so we ended up doing a study there. And by the way, Joe had been at NTIS, and I knew him well, and I think he kind of respected our work pretty much. And so we did a study there, and then he said, and that study was very well received. It was called the Value of the Energy Research Data Bank. And then he said, well, what about the libraries? How much do libraries contribute to that value? So we started doing a study with the libraries that were involved at Oak Ridge National Laboratories and some of the other libraries, and began to look at what the libraries were actually contributing to that value. And that kind of sprung a whole set of studies on the value of libraries, and I'll kind of get back to that in a minute. But there were some other things around that time that we were doing that was kind of interesting too. One is that we were doing a study for the Department of Energy on looking at a metadata system. And what the Department of Energy conducted about 160 ongoing surveys. And what they were finding is that there was a lot of confusion about the the infrastructure of those surveys and how they were run and what was done with the data and this kind of thing. And so we got a contract, actually a big contract, about $1.5 million contract, to look into developing a metadata system for them. I think it was one of the first ones, really. And what we did is to develop a system where we actually looked at the questionnaires and the data that the questionnaires produced, and we followed that data all the way through to the publications. And there were issues of how they handled outliers, how they handled non-item responses, and whether they were getting prices by the sum of the x over the sum of y, or the sum of x over y over n, you know, those kinds of issues. And that system was developed by in I think around 1982, 83, and it went on for at least 15 years, and it still may be, as far as I know. I know in the 90s that it was still active. And one of the interesting things about that particular project is that to get it, we're a small business, and to get it, they said that we had to have somebody who had a good grasp of system architectures, and particularly having to do with index terms and faceted classifications and this kind of thing. So we got the names of 3 of the top people in the world. They said, get the best person you can. And I thought I did. Her name was Jose Marie Griffiths.
Strikes a chord with our school, right?
Yeah, yeah. Anyway, we did hire her, and she got into it right away, and really made a tremendous contribution to that particular project. Another major project that we were doing right around that time had to do with the copyright law that was passed in 1976. There was a question as to whether or not that the publishers were really losing business, and how much photocopying was really taking place, particularly with interlibrary lending and borrowing. And so we did a fairly major study on that, and determined pretty much that there was a lot of photocopying taking place, but as far as the lending and borrowing is concerned, that it wasn't a major issue as far as the publishers. Part of the reason for that is that they negotiated a fair use provision that said if you had fewer than 6 items borrowed from a journal, that you didn't have to pay royalties. Well, that 6 was about the break-even point, and as it turned, it finessed the whole issue. And so we determined that, and so not only estimated the total amount of photocopying, but also how much of it would be under that fair use provision, right, and for the interlibrary borrowing anyway. And I think people pretty well accepted the results, and they updated again. We updated again a little bit later, but the interesting thing about that is that the Copyright Clearance Center was set up as a result of our study, and I was put on the board after a while, and the thing that amazed me is that they were shocked, but they weren't getting this huge amount of royalties, and that the amount of royalties wouldn't cover their costs. And they had some good people, don't get me wrong, and their intentions were good and certainly valid and this kind of thing. But it seemed to me that if they were going to rely on revenue from royalties on interlibrary borrowing, it just wasn't going to work. Mm-hmm. And so they decided that what they were going to do is they were going to include all photocopying. And I thought that was nuts, frankly. And I told them so. I was kind of a gadfly. I kind of insisted that they get a librarian on the board and some things like this. And they did. Ben Weil and some others were really made great contributions to that board. But so they started the notion that they were going to observe all photocopying. And what a burden. See, they were going to get everybody. They were going to get everybody at a photocopy machine to keep track of. Well, it was a burden. I mean, it was something that they just really shouldn't have even considered. So they got a statistician in from Harvard, I think. I forget his name. well, anyway, it doesn't matter. But he suggested that they do it on a sampling basis, and I kind of concurred. I said, look, don't do it. And then finally we went to the idea that we'll do it on an industry basis. We'll look at industries, and if they have so many professionals, they expect to have so much photocopying, and they would use that as a basis for charging on the royalties. And they focused on businesses, and then they, well, anyway, I was never quite in tune with what they were doing, and particularly when the provision on the Texaco case came through, where they had this case where they had they took the files from a filing cabinet of a researcher in Texaco, and they found that he had made a lot of photocopies of articles that he had read. Well, one of the things that I did on some future studies as I continued is I kept track of how much photocopying was taking place. And the point is, so much of that photocopying was from one's own personal subscriptions. You see, and yet sure. that was included in all of that. And they were going to a library and reading a journal and then making photocopies. But the purposes for that were to help with their laboratory notes and things of that kind. So I never quite bought the argument that they made from the Texaco case, because I just felt that so much of that photocopying had no impact at all on the publisher's revenue. In fact, did a little study for CCC that demonstrated that. Now, and once I testified at the Copyright Commission in, I think, around '85, and I said, look, forget about paper photocopying and this kind of thing. The big issue now is going to be electronic publishing. And I said that really what they should do, and this is in the testimony, is that they should look at the subscription that they have as a license. And that license should permit the organization to do as much photocopying as long as that photocopying was done within the organization, and they seem to kind of buy that, but it took a while. I mean, they've kind of gone in that direction, as a matter of fact, after all these years. Now, getting back to the value of libraries, what we did is a whole series of studies, and Jose was very much involved in a lot of this at that time. We did a lot of studies for companies like AT&T, Bell Labs, the National Institutes of Health, the Department of Justice, the FBI Academy, the Procter & Gamble, Bristol Myers Squibb, and a whole bunch of, it must have been 30 or 40 organizations. And all of them were looking at what the value of libraries are. And I felt at that time, and continue to feel, that when you're looking at the value of libraries, and particularly with journal literature and some of the other kinds of literatures, is that you had to put it into a context. And so what we did with the journal literature, for example, is that we looked at reading patterns that scientists and all the professionals have in the organization, because some of that reading came from personal subscriptions, some of it came from libraries, some of it came from other colleagues, and so on, and so we developed, and this was a follow-up of the National Science Foundation survey we did back in 1977, but we looked at questions of how much reading they did, and then we got into a critical incident of reading, and that is how old the article was, how they identified the article, where they got access to the article, whether it was from personal subscription or not, because because professionals make a choice as to where they're going to get that information. And what we kind of discovered is that there's kind of a break-even point. If there's a sufficient amount of reading, then they should get it from their personal subscriptions. If there's less than that, they should go to the library. And so we got costs of those alternative ways of getting that information. And as prices went up, of course, those break-even points began to shift, and people began to go away from their personal subscriptions to the libraries.
Right.
Now, from 1977 in the academic institutions, for example, to 2006, what we found is that the average reading by, say, a scientist in a university went from about 150 to about 250 some. So there was an increase of about 100 readings per scientist.
That would be articles.
Right? Articles, readings of articles. And the interesting thing is that we did all of these studies over the years, and we began to look at trends as to what was happening. And what we found is that during that period of time in the university reading, that the amount of reading from libraries went from, I forget what it was around 40, I think, up to around 100. And no, that's not quite right. Anyway, but the amount of reading from libraries was almost 100. The increase of reading from libraries almost, that looks like everybody was shifting their reading, and then the amount of additional reading was coming from libraries. And we began to understand why that was happening. Part of it was because people were canceling their subscriptions, and part of it was because people were identifying articles more and more from online searching. And when you identify an article from online searching, you have the question about where am I going to locate that article and where am I going to get it. And the obvious place, of course, is libraries. And so we had, and the other thing is too, in recent years with the big deals and aggregated subscriptions to articles and that that has also broadened that out a lot. One of the things we have definitely observed is that in making choices as to how you get your information and this kind of thing, is that those choices are largely based on ease of use and the cost of in your time and effort. Time being the big factor. So and that's true with almost every information system. So we did a lot of interesting stuff during those years, and in around 1995, I decided I'd retire, and I did. And I talked to Yosei about that, and said that, look, I don't really want to retire, but I really don't want to be running businesses. I don't want to worry about getting contracts. I don't want to worry about staff. I just want to do research. And I said that I would like to do the research pretty much on a pro bono basis, and that's what I've done ever since the mid-90s. And one of the reasons that I did that is that we got into this whole controversy between librarians and publishers about whether publishers were ripping off the librarians and so on. It's kind of interesting because back in the late 70s, the shoe was on the other foot. Publishers thought that librarians were ripping them off through their interlibrary borrowing, but exactly. So there was a huge controversy between the two, and it just kind of changed around. But I just decided that my role in life has always been to present information that people can make decisions on, to describe systems, describe environments, and this kind of thing. And that I wanted to continue to do that, and I wanted to do it in a way that would not be considered adversarial or with some kind of a bias. And I felt the way to do that would be by just doing my stuff pro bono, and that's what I've done. Now, Yosei, while she was at Tennessee, hired Carol Tennifer, and Carol and I got a small grant with the Special Libraries Association to look into the whole publishing issue. And we ended up, over a period of about 5 years, writing a book called Electronic Journals, Towards Electronic Journals, Realities for for I think publishers and librarians or something like that. I forget the title of it. Good book though. But Carol and I have been collaborating ever since, and continue to do so. She does all the work there at Tennessee, and she has a great staff working for her, and I really enjoy working with she and her staff. We also began to get some other kinds of studies. One of them was to look at the future of librarians in the workforce. Mm-hmm. It's an ongoing study that we're working on right now. Another study had to do with the use and potential use of online systems, and that's an ongoing study. I've been working on it all week, all year, and I'll tell you a little bit about those two studies because they kind of follow an approach that I've always taken. The online study, it's being done for the Institute of Museums and Library Services. So they wanted to focus on the online use of public libraries and museums. But in order to do that, I felt that it was important to get the context again, like we did on our. Mm-hmm. And so what we did is developed what we call the General Information Survey. By the way, this all together involves about 6,000 household telephone interviews that we're doing, have done, I should say. And the way in which we approach that is to look at important situations in which people needed to get information to make decisions or solve problems and that kind of thing. It's the Brenda Durbin critical incident approach, except we don't go to the depths that she does. She really goes into depth. And she worked with us a little bit on this and kind of gave it the blessing in our approach to it. So, but the purpose of that is to be able to identify those critical situations, then determine what sources of information, that is things like books or articles or people or whatever, and the providers of that information are being used. That is libraries or museums or internet or other kinds of bookstores and so on. And then that gives us kind of an overview so that we can begin to make determine what factors enter into those choices. Why do people go to a library as opposed to going to the internet, and vice versa? Right. And what we have found is that there are issues of trust, issues of time and effort necessary to get that information. Trust is a big one, though, and so we've been able to identify. Interestingly enough, in the studies that Carol Tenneper and I have been doing, what we have found is that having internet access has really increased the use of libraries. Wow, yeah. And that is true with public libraries. It seems to be true with museums. Mm-hmm. That once people use the internet to identify information, then they often have to go to the library to get that information. Or that they trigger interest in the kind of information that you can get in the library. And it's kind of contrary to what a lot of people think. You know, a lot of people are saying, we don't need libraries anymore. That's nonsense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That was going on in the early days of museums with their slides, say, of paintings.
Yeah.
And they didn't want to make them available. They thought people wouldn't come, but the more they did it, the more people wanted to come see the actual painting.
Yes,
the same thing with
I think that's exactly the phenomenon. And there's kind of a personal touch kind of thing. And the other thing is that what we find is that with museums and libraries, for that matter as well, is that if you're doing it for recreational purposes, that you often want to go to the museum to do it. But if you're doing it for schoolwork or for teaching or for work, they use the internet. Isn't that I'm not exactly sure why that is. We're kind of looking into that now. But if people are going, public libraries are used a lot for work purposes, by the way. But we're finding that oftentimes they will go to the internet for the work purposes, more so than they would come to the library to do it. Now, why that is true, I'm not quite sure.
And my guess on that would be that the work-school situation is really driven by the need for the intellectual content, and the entertainment leisure use is really more of a visceral kind of experiential effort, and that may be where the actual physical library, and like you mentioned, the personal touch actually adds a lot of value.
Yeah. Remember the old book, High Tech, High Touch?
Yes.
Yeah, I think there's a little element of that there, as a matter of fact. I'm not sure. We also find that people who visit museums a lot also will look for museum kinds of exhibits and so on the television, and so more than others would. Right. So that's kind of interesting too. I mean, there's kind of an interactive effect. The other thing is that one of the questions that we asked on both the public library survey and the internet survey is whether or not the use of the information led them to other sources or providers of information. And there are about the museum led to about 100 million library uses, and library led to something like 40 million museum uses, which is, so there's kind of an interactive effect there. Of course, IMLS, I think, loves that. Right. but it was kind of an interesting finding, I thought. One of the things that we're doing on this online study, in addition to having this general information survey, kind of giving the broad context, but we have the 3 surveys of public libraries, museums, and the internet itself. But the thing that we do in all of those is to be able to characterize the user population in various ways, mostly by demographics, but other ways in terms of their ease of using internet and that kind of thing. But then trying to tie that into the information needs, where we characterize information needs as those situations, but the situations are addressed to recreational kinds of needs. They're addressed to personal kinds of needs, whether it's health and wellness or finance or shopping, and we have a whole categorization of the personal kinds of needs, and so we can determine who are using the information for those different kinds of needs. Then we have a whole set of questions that deal with the sources, which are books and articles and that kind of thing, and the providers, which are libraries and bookstores and the internet, and then access modes, that is, they do it in person or do they do it through the internet and that kind of thing. And so we can begin to tie all of that together very nicely. But in addition to that, we can look at the attributes of the information sources, providers, and the access modes, because those attributes will make a difference as to the extent to which they're going to be used. And the very obvious one is a distance to a library. The further you're from a library, the less you're going to use it, and the more you'll use it through the internet. So you have those kind of attributes, and quality and trustworthiness are also enter into that kind of attributes. So you can begin to tie those uses to the attributes of the sources, and you can do it with the information itself. There are attributes of information, such as the quality of the information, the completeness of it, and this kind of thing. And you begin to relate the extent to which that information is used based on what those attributes are. Then we look at a higher level, which is what's the impact? That is, how does it affect people in terms of quality of life, or saving them time and money, or improving productivity and organizations and that kind of thing. And we can kind of tie all of that together. So we've used those kind of models to begin to tie all that stuff together. That's kind of neat stuff.
It is. As you've been talking, I've been thinking in the earlier studies, you found that sort of cost and ease of access were really the very big factors in say back in the 60s, 70s.
Yeah.
And now this idea of trust actually has become, is that really a new issue?
I don't think it's a new issue. I think we just identified it for the first time.
Okay.
I don't say the first time. I think there are others who understand that trust and quality and that kind of thing are important.
But all the junk that's out there on the internet may sort of makes this maybe easier to identify.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And we're finding that people are unhappy with the amount of information they get, and it depends on the use the needs. If it's health issues, they trust is important.
Right.
And now I think that there's some false perceptions of trust, but,
of course.
but we haven't been able to identify, nor will we identify. But there are some issues of that kind too. But it's a pretty neat study, and we're just doing all the interesting analysis on it now, and it's and we have some graduate students here, Song Pan, and boy, what a wonderful guy he is.
Yes.
He is so good.
Yeah.
He's a real help. But anyway, on the other study, the future of librarians in the workforce, what we are doing there is trying to forecast what the future demand is going to be for librarians. The issue kind of came up initially because they were identifying the fact that the library workforce is graying. In other words, there were a lot of older people, and there didn't seem to be younger people coming into the workforce. And so what we're doing is looking at the different types of libraries, public libraries, academic libraries, special libraries, and school libraries, and identifying trends in terms of the extent to which the libraries are being used, what is happening in the kinds of services that they're providing, and the competencies that are necessary to provide these services and that kind of thing. And one of the ways in which we're looking at that is to find out what the career paths of our librarians. And we're working a little bit with Joanne Marshall and her wonderful study that she's doing for IMLS in that regard. And we're kind of developing kind of a actuarial kind of a model, so we know how many people come in and go out, come back into the library workforce, and whether whether the different reasons they leave, whether it's illness or whether they want to get a better job and this kind of thing. And this actuarial model seems to be working fairly well. And the only problem that we have with the study is that response rates are horrible.
Oh, right.
God, we're around 30% now with the libraries, and that's about what they got up at Canada doing the same study in a different way. Ours kind of complements theirs in a nice way, but we're kind of extending the study, trying to get those response rates up, and that's a toughie. When I was doing studies back in the 70s, 80s with libraries, I had no problem. We'd always get up around 60-70% of response rates, and it's partially because of the importance of the studies, but boy, it's just gotten awful in recent years, and the libraries say, well, we're just saturated. We get so many surveys that we just either don't do them, or we put you on. Yours is a tough one, and we kind of put you on the back burner. And
Ken Boland, who participated in this series a while back, was also sort of talking about the same problem with phone surveys and any sort of data for just getting people who use caller ID to filter and skewing the population of responses as a result.
Oh yeah, we find the same thing on our telephone interviews, and the group that is doing this for us, it's a group like Odom downstairs, but we started with a group up in Pittsburgh, the University of Pittsburgh, called the UXAR and University Center for Social Research or something. I don't know.
Right. Yeah.
But they're good.
Yeah.
I really enjoy working with it. But they go to the national meetings, and everybody is complaining about the telephone response rates. And we've done 2 statewide studies on the return on investment in public libraries. One in Pennsylvania, one in Florida. And when we did the Florida one, we had telephone interviews, and it was right during the 2004 elections, and it was tough. It was tough. Yeah. I think one of the things is we seem to get a fair number of responses from the different demographics, age and sex and this kind of thing, but we have to weight it. What we do is weight it proportionally up to the known population for those demographics, and that kind of helps kind of adjust it back to what it's probably. What we find on the telephone interviews, for example, is that younger people respond less than older people, and women respond more than men do, and about 40 to 60 as a matter of fact.
Wow.
And but you just adjust that back so that you get a reasonably represented, and you weight it up to the population totals. But I think that the 2 studies we did for Florida and Pennsylvania were really good studies, and what they asked us to do in Florida is to develop a calculator for public libraries, so they could collect data, put it into our calculator, and it'll just crank out results for them. And we're doing that. We're testing it on 2 libraries down in Florida right now. Sam Penn's working on that with me, and that's an interesting project.
And we're finding, I hope, that there is a good return on
oh,
investment.
Absolutely. Yeah, it tends to be anywhere from about 2 up to around 4 or 5.
Wow.
Well, it's different. It's different for special libraries and academic libraries, because with public libraries, you have different contributions to the return on investment. For example, the fact that you have staff there is contributing to the economic welfare of that community, because they have salaries, they buy things, they pay taxes and things like that. So that's a contribution. They purchase things from the local communities or throughout the state, so they're contributing in that way. We find that when people come to libraries, they often go to a restaurant in the local area, in the neighborhood, or the bank or the stores. And interestingly enough, in England, they had a community that had a strike of public librarians, and some very smart researcher there went back and said, "What's the effect on that strike on the retailers?" And they found that the revenue went down around 23%.
Wow.
So we call that the halo effect, and we put that in. We find out how much people purchase on their visits, and then we partition that between the visits to the communities and then the visit to the library. But there another effect is that libraries have gift shops and things like that. Contributes a little bit. The main effect, though, is what we call the contingent valuation, and that is that if you didn't have a public library, where would people get the information they get, and what would it cost them to get that information? Now, this is an analysis that I've done way back into the early 70s. I just didn't know there was an economic name for it until recently. But what we do, and we do it that's part of what we do on our academic library. But what we do is say, if you didn't have a library, what would you do to get the information? Well, about 20% of them say, I wouldn't do anything. I wouldn't bother. You find that a few say that I would like to get the information, but I don't know where to go to get it. Now, so they're going to lose some value because there's some value in the information they get. Now, I'll elaborate on that in just a minute. But the thing is that We know what the cost of using the library. We know the cost of going to the library. We know the cost in the library. And we got some details on that. How much time they spend. We put a value on time and this kind of thing. And then we subtract that against the cost to go to the alternatives. And that is what we call the net value.
Okay.
And or net benefit.
Right.
And as I say, I've been doing that for years. But with the public libraries, you have the contribution of the salaries and the purchases. You don't have that in the academic libraries. See, the academic libraries, it's strictly a matter of the contingent value of what it would cost to go if you didn't have a library, and where they would go and this kind of thing. And one of the things, for example, that is that we find that by having electronic access to journals. Right. That they save an average of about 20 hours per person, per faculty member. Doesn't sound like much, but if you got 2,500 faculty members like you do in Pitt, that's 50,000 hours. Right. That's 25 people, full-time equivalents. And so anyway. So you know, if you can get that kind of information, it helps to understand what the usefulness and value of libraries are. Right.
That's fascinating and useful, and I can see why not only IMLS but governments, states, and corporations are always after you to work with them to try and do these studies of evaluation. It's the value of the information, value of libraries, and you've established a marvelous sort of model for people to use.
I think it's a useful model, and you know, there's a little bit of speculation in on that and this kind of thing, but my gosh, think about it. I mean, if you didn't have a library, what would you do? I mean, it seems to me to be such a obvious thing to look at, and the thing is that when we do it, when it's replicated, we always get similar results, and that helps a lot. Right. That helps a lot, so that there's some, by redundancy, there's some indication that what we're doing is along the right path. That just one other quick kind of study, just before I forget about it, and that is that I did do some detailed cost analysis of libraries, and recently with the cost of processing electronic journals and print journals, and to try to look at what it cost if you went entirely electronic, how much savings would you have, and this kind of thing. The problem is that we find that some people still want the print, and with personal subscriptions, it's about 80% of it still in print, whereas libraries, it's around 85% electronic now. Wow. So but the cost studies were done on Yale, Cornell, Drexel, Pitt, and 11 different libraries.
So when you say that 85% of the library subscriptions are electronic, that doesn't preclude them also getting the print?
Oh no. What I'm saying, the 85% of the readings from the library collections are in print. Got it. I mean, are electronic. But with personal subscriptions, they're still reading in print primarily, which a lot of publishers don't understand, by the way. I mean, they get those subscriptions, but every now and then they'll say, no, we're going entirely electronic, and then they find that wasn't a good decision.
I get a little bit annoyed at some of the editorial boards I'm on when they just assume that I only want the electronic, and my volumes sort of start to just end. No,
but it just, I'm not exactly sure why it is. We most of our studies, we don't kind of delve into reasons and what the thought processes are and this kind of thing. But it's clear that people really want those personal subscriptions in print, and they just, whether it's the ease of thumbing through it or whatever it is, or being able to take it with them someplace and when they travel and
I find that if I don't get the paper copies of the journal, I actually don't read or stay up as much. I can find articles when I go search for them in, say, the ACM Digital Library or what have you. But having that comes in, I scan it, and I sort of get an overview very quickly. And I don't usually get that. I mean, I don't really use the alerting services as much as perhaps I should. But I think there's something about that sort of having it there at hand. That makes a big difference.
We may get away from it, but I think I think it'll be a while. I think it'll be a while. Anyway, I have to say that I feel so fortunate to have been involved in that patent office contract, because it got me into this field. I love the field. I love the people that I work with. I remember that the patent office asked me to go down to Miami, North Hollywood, to an ADI, the old ACES. Back in, must have been around 82 maybe, or I mean 62. Time flies. But I really enjoyed the meeting. I just enjoyed the people who were there. We had good contacts and good discussions, and I just really got caught up in the ACES community, and don't regret it for a minute. I'm really glad that I got into this.
Well, and you've done a lot to develop and promote and sort of nurture the ACES community from the days of the documentation to information science, serving as president and the editor of Arist for years. So we all owe you a debt of gratitude on the professional side, and it tells me a lot that in this discussion you've really talked about your research, and it's just so uplifting and inspiring to sort of see that passion that you have for the research. It's a wonderful gift that you bring to our field. Well,
if I get up some morning and I'm not just chomping at the bit to get at it, then I'll stop it. You know, I'm 75 now, and but I'll keep doing it as long as I enjoy doing it. And I don't know, that may be a long time.
We certainly hope so. Don, I want to thank you very, very much for your time and these thoughts, and we will continue this, and I'll look forward to your participation in the doctoral seminar this fall.
Well, I'm looking forward to it too, and I thank you, and I'm kind of rattled on a little bit, but
not at all.
Yeah.
This is great.